My guests today are Kimya Lee, the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer for Strategic Operations at Homeland Security Department. We're also joined by Sharon Wong, the Executive Director for Strategic Talent Recruitment, Inclusive Diversity and Engagement, or STRIDE, also at the Homeland Security Department. Sharon, thank you too for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Today we are talking, as you can tell by their titles, about the recruiting new employees, retaining employees, working with hiring managers. The whole focus area over the last couple of years has been really to try to improve how agencies recruit, retain, and really model themselves for the next generation of workers. So Kimya, I'll start with you. Let's talk a little bit about the Homeland Security Department's strategy to recruit these new employees, and specifically, how has it evolved over the last few years?
Thanks for the question. Not only at Homeland Security, but I would imagine both in the federal space, but also in private sector, how we were recruiting even 2 years ago doesn't work right now. Like, we had to make a shift. And for us, that shift is not only internally, one, taking care of our employees who are on board, but really reimagining and being a little more innovative of how we, advertise our jobs, but also just tapping into talent even before they're starting to think, oh, maybe I can work at Homeland Security. And so part of that is not only working with some of the universities, but we're also starting to think through, how do we tap into those communities that we're serving? And so it may be a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old, and they're in the community and they see Homeland Security. We can start getting them interested at a younger age. When you think about the tools that we have for recruiting and hiring, it changed. The pandemic changed everything. And so now we do have more flexibility, and we realize that productivity increases when maybe you don't have to be in the office. And so this gives us the opportunity to touch on areas that we weren't recruited for before, because maybe someone in Utah doesn't want to move to the Washington, D.C. area. But now, because we have lots of flexibilities for either telework or remote work, we can tap into that overall talent outside of our Washington, D.C., but also areas where we usually recruit. Sharon, do you want to add to anything?
Sure. I mean, Kimya, I think that was a great answer. You captured it all, right? You started with how we used to do it, a very traditional way, like that everybody else was doing, was in person, right? And the pandemic really forced us to look at it differently. And even now, as we're coming, we're back in person for the most part, because it also taught us to continue some of those virtual engagements, right? Because if you think about it, in-person ones, if you had it at a location, folks had to come into that. But now we're doing some of these hybrid ones, even though we are now going back to in-person ones. But also, as our strategy has evolved, it's who we are including, right? And I'll give a little bit more detail than what Kimya did. But it's how we're now engaging groups, right? Like we talk about our employee resource groups, right? At DHS, we call them employee associations. But it's not your typical, when you think of ERGs, right? They're not just for, Hispanics or African Americans. Our employee groups are broadened to like returning Peace Corps volunteers. We have an employee group around that, veterans, and they're really the ones that have been outreaching, getting the word out to families, colleagues, people in those specific communities. We have now, relationships with colleges and universities. We have developed memorandums of understandings with over 24 minority serving institutions. So we're really expanding our strategy, making use of technology. We've been doing these webinars. DHS is hiring webinars in advance of recruiting events. And at these events, we talk about the event, what's coming, who are we targeting, what our mission is, available job opportunities. So people don't just show up an event, right? They're targeted, they know. At these webinars, we're even helping them, providing tips and tools for even how they write their resumes, right? Because if you think of how you write a federal resume, right? The things that are important, we also look at it by generations. What we're seeing that's important to younger generations these days is about our inclusive diversity efforts. So we talk about that, not just strictly the mission, but a very holistic picture.
Two things I'll go back to, because I think this is very much key. First, what Kimia said about trying to get into the communities, maybe communities that maybe have been underserved before, or just maybe you haven't paid enough attention to because they were so far outside of the DC area. And then looking at that next generation, are there things you're doing through your current employees to kind of help them tell that story about why working at DHS is valuable, why you can make a difference, and why you should do more than just consider it? Are there things you all are doing around to kind of help those hiring managers, HR employees kind of tell that compelling story?
So I think it's not just the hiring managers, HR. Our secretary believes that every employee at DHS is a recruiter. And so when we're sitting at our tables with our family, we're talking about our work, we're talking about DHS, when we're playing pick up basketball in a community center. We are recruiters, we are ambassadors to DHS. And so I think that's why it's so important for that interplay between being that recruiter, understanding what's going on at DHS, and taking care of our employees who are at DHS. And so we can't separate the recruitment part from the folks, the employee engagement and the morale part. And so I do think it is that we are over 250,000 strong. And so that means we have over 250,000 recruiters out there telling our story.
And if I may just build onto that, how we are telling the story. And I said, it's through the use of all of these technology, right? Whether we do webinars but one of the things we do is we do these, what we call a day in the life of. So you put our employees in front of, whether it's a camera or whether it's an in-person event, that really they share the stories and advice regarding careers or personal and professional growth. Talk about what it is that they do. And that's why it's called a day in the life, because then I think people can see and relate, right? If I tell you what my life is every day, I think that becomes much more impactful, right? Another thing too, as you talk about how do we ensure that both HR and hiring managers, right, we want to make sure that they're all aware of the flexibilities that are out there, right? We've talked about there's over 100 different hiring authorities that exist to bring in qualified candidates, right? And that is humanly impossible to remember all 100 and which one to use when. So it's marrying it up, that hiring manager who that's not his or her job, or their job to know what those are. And that's why that marriage as such between the HR and the hiring manager to tell that compelling story.
I've heard that number before, the 100 different hiring authorities. It's something that is just crazy. First, soon everything will be a hiring authority and nothing will be just a typical hire. But I think that's above all our pay grades to discuss that. The other thing I'll go back to is something that obviously, Sharon, you brought up the employee resource groups, the employee associations. You said some of those folks, whether it's returning Peace Corps volunteers or veterans, are some of your best ways to get the word out. Is that something that you all developed over the last couple of years? Have they been within DHS for several years and you've re-energized them recently? Talk a little bit about those groups.
Sure. We have over a dozen currently that are department-wide, right? But even within our various components and agencies, they have their own EAs as well, right? The employee associations. And I would say some of that, of course, there's several that are fairly new that like the returning Peace Corps volunteers, right? Though that one has really been within the last couple of years. But I will say that some of the more established ones, even the ones now, it's been more a reinvigorating, right? We also have our deputy secretary that is such a champion, because before he was at DHS, he was a champion out in private industry. So he's really latched on to the employee associations, and because of his interest and championing, we have really seen much more active involvement. And, they serve many purposes, right? There are those that, of course, they'll do the network. They're there for networking, building their community. There are those that do outreach to communities. There are those that will put on their own big conferences, right, for their community. So it really ranges. And so, yes, it has been a reinvigorating, but then there are those that have been existing for some time. But the sense we get, they're all very excited, right? Our deputy secretary has committed to meeting with at least one every month. I mean, to have that kind of exposure and visibility really gets people engaged, that he's willing to take the time to sit down, listen, champion, advocate for them.
The other thing that does is it really creates that connection. You mentioned some have conferences, some do networking, some are doing outreach, but also creates that connection within the entire department. Because as Kimia said, it's 250,000 strong. It's a lot of people, a lot of very complex missions, a lot of very different missions. CBP does something different than TSA, which does something different than FEMA, but they all work together. Kimia, maybe this is a question for you. Is this also part of that employee engagement challenge? Because for years, DHS has struggled with the FEVS scores, but we've seen some increases happening. Is this part of how you all are addressing the challenges around employee engagement?
Yeah, I think it's a very holistic approach. So like you mentioned, CBP's mission is very different than TSA. That's very different than Coast Guard or FLETC. And so what we're doing is part of the overall engagement is we're also taking headquarters and really working with the field. So having a better understanding what's going on and those pretty complex components, but allowing headquarters employees, what we call our engagement team, go to on the ground field sectors to see what it's like for them to work in their environment. And what we're trying to do is there's some stuff that we're hoping we could correct pretty quickly, right? And so there's some basic needs that we feel that by addressing those basic needs, hey, this printer haven't worked for 3 years, or if only we had X, or if only we had faster Wi-Fi. By allowing headquarters, whether headquarters, DHS headquarters, or those component headquarters, with teams go out to the field and talk with those employees, whether it's not as focus groups, one-on-ones, and see if we can really address some of those basic needs pretty quickly and cut through some of the red tape that everyone has with a large agency to help with their overall engagement. The other thing I want to say, specifically since we talked about the employee associations and the community, part of that engagement is engaging with their families. And so specifically when we talk about our agents, our Border Patrol agents, our officers, our frontline workers, we understand when they're in the front line, their family's also in the front line. And so we're taking this approach where we are meeting as a community to talk through what's going on at the department, but also benefits, and seeing if we could really think of our employees with their whole experience, not just their 10-hour, 12-hour shift.
All right, that's a good spot. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion Government Modernization Unleashed Workforce, sponsored by EY on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Government Modernization Unleashed Workforce, sponsored by EY on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Kimia Lee, the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer for Strategic Operations for the Homeland Security Department, and Sharon Wong, the Executive Director of the Strategic Talent Recruitment, Inclusive Diversity and Engagement, or STRIDE, also at the Homeland Security Department. Sharon, Kimia, before break, we heard a little bit about the engagement piece and the idea that, as Kimia talked about, going out to the field, talking with the folks who work in the day-to-day operations and figure out, okay, what do they need? How can headquarters help them go through some of that red tape, as well as working with families? Sharon, let me turn to you a little bit and ask you to offer a little bit of insights in terms of, from your perspective with Stride, how are you also addressing that engagement challenge?
Sure. Kimia has really put a very high level frame on it. But, everything that we've done, we came up with this new framework, right? Our employee engagement framework. And we're looking at that to really use it to measure and improve our everyday employee experience, right? And it's focused around enhancing our ability to hear employee input and then really infuse their voices. It's one thing that we go around and we listen, but are we really taking what they're saying? And are we really doing something with that? And are we really making meaningful change? And we are doing this through pulse surveys. Kimia talked about, the focus groups or how we're going on the ground. But we're doing this through, the pulse surveys. We do focus groups. We're going out to the border, where there's a southern border, the northern border, and even leadership visits, right? Our secretary and deputy secretary are doing these employee engagement and even senior leader engagement efforts. And so what this framework does, it posits really 6 dimensions that are the primary drivers of the employee experience. So this whole thing is really, that's why it's called employee engagement. It's focused on the employee, right? And to Kimia's point, she talked earlier, it's really around basic needs, recognition, and confidence. Are we meeting their basic needs? Are we providing the tools for them to meet what it is that they need? And so, as simple as employee health, right? Fitness, sleep, nutrition, financial security, even getting breaks so that they can maintain focus, right? And when we talk about confidence, it's that they're empowered, that they feel that there's alignment between their jobs and the department's mission, right? And then recognition. We all want to be recognized for what we're doing. So that's the framework from which this is all built. Now, I mentioned that, focus groups and jump teams. Jump teams is really where we are going out. We are talking, when we did the focus groups, we heard a set of issues. So then we send in these teams, we're calling them jump teams. They go out into the field and it's really about problem solving around issues. They may seem small, but if you're living these on a day-to-day basis, these have such an outsized impact on their experience, right? So here's an example, going out to the southwest border, right? They are now, some of the things we heard was around IT issues. So they're sending specialists out to review and replace old equipment, right? So some of us would never think, but when you think of things like bandwidth, old equipment, and just having teams go out there and hearing from employees and being able to fix those problems. Facilities issues, build old buildings, even old office equipment. So there's a lot of things as we hear people. There was even one around, mission support staff, chronically overextended, right? But they support our frontline workforce. And so while it's not just about focusing on the frontline employees, what about those who are supporting them, right? They were looking at, they would really value telework. And so site leadership started to look at that. There was another example with regards to the use of Narcan. We had Narcan for their K9s, but staff didn't realize that we also had it for them. And so just that simple communication, those are some of the things that we're finding, things that seem so small, but it makes their lives so much better.
Sharon, you bring up a really important point. It's those small things, right? It's easy to complain about a job. I have so much work to do, but if my technology doesn't work, if my building's leaking, if the water fountains, every third water fountain's broken, that just makes things even harder and makes you kind of more negative about the job, even if the job generally is helpful and valuable and you feel good about it. But those little things, maybe talk a little bit about those jump teams. Are they 3 to 5 people? Are they one person? How often do they go out? Any other details?
So, we started piloting that the last few months, right? And now we've completed 3 so far. These teams are anywhere from half a dozen or so. And for example, if we're going to a site that we know it's IT issues, or it's fleet or facilities, we will bring from the appropriate headquarters office the folks that are in charge or leading those efforts, right? So we'll bring somebody from our CIO office, somebody from our security office, somebody from our facilities office. And so depending on what the issue is in that particular location that we identified from focus groups, we'll go out there. But here's the thing, we also bring the local component, the local site, right? Because this is not just about headquarters coming in to fix your problems kind of message. That is not what we want to send, right? So we were, for example, when I said we went out to the southwest border, so we very much had the CBP folks, right? So CBP headquarters folks came out, and then even the local CBP folks were there as well. So that's who constitutes the teams, right? And then also based on the functional areas, we generally go out for about a week, maybe a week and a half, depending on how many sites we hit in that region. Have meetings with individuals. Again, we will do visits. We will see what the actual issues are. We will talk to folks. We'll have a meeting with the local leadership, but also meet with the employees who are living this day to day, right? Sit down. We not just say, what are your problems, but we also try to problem solve while we are there. A lot of it is listening, right? Understanding what the issues is. And then after that, we come back, we debrief, we try to look at what are the things, did everybody hear the same thing? And then we start briefing it up. We brief our leadership here at headquarters. We brief all the way up. We make sure that we brief back the component leadership, right? So that they know this is that partnership. Again, because this is a message of, we are in this together. You have an issue, how can we help, right? So that's kind of process, of course, then takes several weeks, right? The planning to go out, the coming back, and then all the briefs and making sure, if we're there, we might have heard a problem and we didn't bring someone out, it's coming back. And sometimes it's a matter of calling back and say, hey, can we get such and such on the phone as well? Because something's come up we weren't anticipating. And we're tracking all the issues that we have heard, assigning them to the appropriate person, but not just doing that, but then following up back that they have addressed these.
The one thing I would add to that is, I know we're talking about this team and how, I want to mention how it started. The JUMP team was created after we started doing focus groups and on the ground talk. And so we brought back individuals who participated in those focus groups, and we said, like, how can we help? And those teams came up with this notion of, it will be great if there was more on the ground, take a look at what's going on. And that's how these teams were created. And so it's not that management or senior leaders came up with this notion of sending a small group out to the field to see if we could help them take care of some of their immediate needs. It actually came out of employees who said this will be really helpful. And so I want to mirror that up. It's not only just doing, but it's listening and turning that listening into something that's actionable.
Kimmy, I think that's really an important point that you bring up, that this is not being driven from the top, but really from the bottom up. And then you all said, as senior leaders, oh, this makes absolutely great sense. Let's do it. Because it also shows that headquarters isn't just demanding you do things, telling you what to do. Imagine that also helps drive that not just engagement, but getting folks, again, to circle back around to the recruitment side, to drive that great story about, hey, yes, there are problems. Yes, there's challenges, but our management is much of different management today than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago when DHS, really first started. Is that the other message you're really trying to drive home? Because you want them to be those recruiters. You want them to go out and talk about the good experience they have working day to day, whether it's on the border or as a TSO or in headquarters.
I would agree, and I think so. At the end of the day, as a DHS employee, um, you know, this is a complex, sometimes extremely challenging agency. But if you talk to any of our employees, there's no other mission that they would rather be working in. And whether or not that's an agent at CBP, whether or not that's a trainer at FLETC, or a cyber security analyst at CISA, or even the Coast Guard or Secret Service, I do think that a lot of times when you're so focused on a single number, so earlier you mentioned the FEBs, that single number, you lose uh, really the persons or the people behind that. And so, again, like Sharon said, we have this framework, and at the base, it's the basic needs. And then we get to the other needs. And sometimes it is that leaky, if only I could use this water fountain to fill up my full water bottle. And it sounds silly, but if you're in the office day in and day out, it does drag on you. And I think that by DHS and with our current leadership, with the secretary, the deputy secretary, and everyone else, they understand that we need to take care of our workforce. Our workforce takes care of the American public. And that's the big takeaway.
We got about a minute left. Sharon, let me just give you maybe the last word here. If there's one or two things you're really trying to accomplish for the rest of fiscal 2023 and beyond, if you could just maybe give us one or two things you're really focused on.
So I would say, this conversation has been around engagement and recruitment. So I would say that our takeaways from this would be, so let me start with the engagement, right? And this is what we've really covered. The theme is, it's about, we're creating mechanisms to hear from employees and how to communicate with them, right? Because a big piece of this is communicating. But it's not just communicating in its broadest sense. It's about their experiences, it's about the challenges, but even also the successes, right, on the job, because this creates opportunities for leadership to understand the employee viewpoint, understand their circumstances, and then say, what can we do? Let's develop action plans that we execute and address where we can, right? Because that's what creates this trust between employees and leaders. And we always say, if you make sure that people are included and feel they have a voice, inclusion really drives engagement. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. Because when people feel this, they'll go out and accomplish the mission for you, right? The other piece is with regards to recruitment, and this also, I feel again, recruitment and engagement tie so much together. We understand the importance of diversifying the workforce, right? And we know that recruitment and engagement are top, not just for the administration, they're not just top priorities for the administration, but also for our DHS leadership, our secretary, deputy secretary, and our entire leadership. So as part of that, we constantly reevaluate our approach and our strategies. And so we look at what are our policies, what are our procedures, what framework we need to make sure we are putting in place and executing, because I don't just want to always be putting things in place. Are we actually doing something, right? So that they guide us so that we can be more intentional. Because to me, it's about being more intentional, whether it's our outreach, it's how we're selecting talent, how we're engaging our employees and retaining them, helping them, and also about developing our employees, right? So that's what I would like.
All right. Well, we covered a lot of that today. Obviously, there's so much more to talk about, and unfortunately, we are out of time for today. So first, let me thank my guest. Kimya Lee is the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer for Strategic Operations at the Homeland Security Department. Kimya, thanks so much for taking the time.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
And Sharon Wong is the Executive Director of the Strategic Talent Recruitment, Inclusive Diversity Engagement, or STRIDE, also at the Homeland Security Department. Sharon, thank you as well for your time today.
And thank you for having us. Great conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Government Modernization Unleashed Workforce, sponsored by EY on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search EY.